Billionaire lost his memory after the accident, but the first face he saw made his heart tremble. Before we begin, drop a comment telling us which city you're watching from, and once the story ends, don't forget to rate it from 0 to 10. Oh, and make sure to follow our channel for more stories like this. Now, sit back and enjoy every detail. Some men believe they can control fate until fate decides to teach them otherwise. Evander Sloan's fingers drummed against the mahogany steering wheel of his charcoal gray Tesla Model X as he sat in the underground parking garage of the Meridian Tower. The fluorescent lights cast harsh shadows across his sharp jawline, highlighting the tension that had become his constant companion. At 35, he had built an empire in electric mobility that most men could only dream of, yet satisfaction remained as elusive as the Seattle rain that never seemed to stop. His phone buzzed against the leather seat. Another message from his assistant. Probably about tomorrow's board meeting or the acquisition deal that had been keeping him awake for weeks. Evander didn't reach for it. Instead, he stared at the concrete wall ahead where someone had scratched graffiti that read, "Life's too short," in jagged letters. Life's too short. The irony wasn't lost on him. His life felt anything but short. It felt like an endless sequence of calculated moves, strategic decisions, and quarterly reports that stretched into infinity. The meeting with the investors had gone exactly as planned. Numbers had been presented, projections analyzed, handshakes exchanged, everything perfect, controlled, predictable, just the way he liked it, just the way he had orchestrated every aspect of his existence since he was old enough to understand that emotions were liabilities and spontaneity was the enemy of success. Evander finally reached for his phone, scrolling through the 17 missed calls and 43 unread messages. His jaw tightened as he read the subject lines. Merger details, market analyses, requests for his time that he didn't have and didn't want to give. His calendar was booked solid for the next 6 months. Every minute accounted for every social interaction serving a business purpose. He started the engine, the electric motor, purring to life with barely a whisper. The dashboard glowed blue in the darkness, displaying his route home to his penthouse overlooking Elliott Bay, 28 minutes in current traffic. He could review the Henderson contract during the drive, maybe squeeze in a call with his Tokyo partners before midnight. As he pulled out of the garage, Seattle's midnight street stretched before him like black veins. The rain had started again, fat droplets splattering against his windshield with increasing intensity. Most of the city was asleep, but Evander's mind raced ahead to tomorrow's challenges. Next week's presentations, next quarter's targets. He took the 520 bridge, preferring the longer route that avoided downtown traffic. The lake below was invisible in the darkness, but he knew it was there, just like everything else in his life, existing exactly where it should be, when it should be there. His penthouse waited with its floor-to-ceiling windows, its minimalist furniture, its silence that echoed with the absence of anyone who truly knew him. The phone rang through his car's speakers. "Mr. Sloan." His assistant's voice cut through his thoughts. "The Singapore contracts need your signature before—" "Not now, Miranda." Evander Unk's voice was clipped. "Professional, schedule it for first thing tomorrow." "But sir, the time difference." "I said not now." He ended the call and pressed harder on the accelerator. The speedometer climbed as he navigated the winding road that led toward his neighborhood. Rain hammered the roof now, turning the world outside into a blur of darkness and reflected streetlights. Evander Sloan had spent 15 years building walls around his heart, constructing a fortress of success that no one could penetrate. He had everything he had ever planned for: wealth, power, respect, control. Everything except the one thing he had convinced himself he didn't need. As he rounded the sharp curve on Pine Valley Road, his headlights caught the reflective eyes of a deer standing frozen in the middle of the asphalt. Time slowed to a crystalline moment of clarity, the animal's terrified gaze, the squeal of brakes on wet pavement, the sickening sensation of losing control. For the first time in 35 years, Evander Sloan's perfectly ordered world spun completely out of his grasp. The last thing he saw before everything went black was his phone screen lighting up with another urgent message he would never read. When you lose everything you thought to find you, sometimes the first thing you see becomes your entire world. The steady beeping of machines pulled Evander from the depths of unconsciousness, like a fishing line dragging him up from dark water. His eyelids felt impossibly heavy, weighted down by exhaustion that seemed to seep into his very bones. The taste in his mouth was metallic, foreign, accompanied by a throbbing in his skull that pulsed in rhythm with his heartbeat. Where was he? The question floated through his mind like smoke, impossible to grasp. He tried to remember anything, but found only fragments, rain on glass, the smell of leather, a deer's frightened eyes. Everything else was wrapped in cotton, muffled and distant. Easy there. The voice was soft, feminine, tinged with the kind of patience that spoke of long nights and difficult cases. You're safe. You're in the hospital. Evander forced his eyes open, blinking against the harsh fluorescent lights that seemed to pierce straight through to his brain. The world swam in and out of focus, shapes and shadows dancing at the edges of his vision. Gradually, the blur began to clear, and that's when he saw her. Standing beside his bed, adjusting something on the four-pole, was a woman with shoulder-length auburn hair, pulled back in a practical ponytail. Her scrubs were navy blue, slightly wrinkled from what looked like a long shift. But it was her face that made his heart skip, not from recognition, because he was certain he had never seen her before, but from something deeper, more primal. She had the kind of beauty that snuck up on you. Gentle green eyes that seemed to see too much, a spray of freckles across her nose, lips that looked like they smiled easily, but were currently pressed together in concentration. There was something about the way she moved, economical, purposeful, but with an underlying grace that suggested she was comfortable in her own skin. "Hi," she said, noticing a stare. Her voice carried a slight rasp, as if she'd been working all night. "I'm Delaney, your night nurse. How are you feeling, Delaney?" The name rolled through his mind like music. He tried to speak, but his throat felt raw, scratched. She must have anticipated this, because she was already reaching for a cup of water with a straw. "Small sips," she instructed, holding the cup steady while he drank. The water was cold, soothing against his parched throat. "You've been unconscious for 36 hours. Your body needs time to adjust." 36 hours. He searched his memory for what had happened, but found only disconnected pieces. A meeting, rain, the screech of brakes. I was driving," he managed, his voice an unfamiliar to his own ears. "That's right." Delaney checked something on her tablet, her movements efficient, but unhurried. "Single vehicle accident on Pine Valley Road. You're lucky to be alive. Your car flipped twice before hitting a tree." She looked up from her notes, studying his face with professional concern. "Do you remember your name?" The question should have been simple. Names were basic, fundamental. But as he reached for it in his mind, he found only emptiness where the answer should be. Panic began to rise in his chest like a tide. "I know, I don't remember." Delaney's expression softened, but she didn't seem surprised. "That's okay. You have a concussion among other injuries. Some memory loss is normal. Your wallet had your ID. You're Evander Sloan." He repeated the name silently, waiting for it to feel familiar, to trigger some cascade of memories. Nothing. It was just a word as meaningless as any other. But watching Delaney say it, seeing the way her lips formed the syllables, made something warm unfurl in his chest. "The doctor will want to run more tests," she continued, making notes on her tablet. "But your vital signs are stable, which is what matters right now." As she worked, Evander found himself studying her face, memorizing the gentle curve of her jaw, the way she tucked a strand of escaped hair behind her ear, the small scar above her left eyebrow that suggested its own story. In a world where nothing made sense, where his own name felt foreign, she was becoming his anchor. "Are you in pain?" she asked, glancing up and catching his stare. He was his ribs arched, his head pounded. There were bandages on his arms that suggested injuries he couldn't remember receiving, but none of that seemed to matter when she looked at him like that, with eyes that were kind, without being pitying, professional without being cold. He admitted. Delaney reached for something on the medical cart beside his bed. "I can give you something for that, but it might make you drowsy." "No." The word came out more urgently than he intended. The thought of losing consciousness again, of losing sight of her face, filled him with inexplicable dread. "I want to stay away." She paused, her hand hovering over the medication. Something flickered across her expression. Surprise, maybe, or understanding. "Okay. But if it gets worse, let me know." "If it gets," as she continued her rounds, checking monitors and adjusting his IV, Evander realized that for the first time in what felt like forever, he wasn't thinking about schedules or meetings, or the crushing weight of responsibilities he couldn't even remember. He was thinking about the way Delaney's eyes crinkled slightly at the corners when she concentrated, and how her presence made the sterile hospital room feel less like a prison. "Delaney," he said, testing her name on his tongue. She looked up. "Yes. Thank you for taking care of him." "Yes, but also for being the first thing that made sense in a world that had become completely senseless, for being the face that his heart recognized even when his mind couldn't recognize his own. She smiled, then the first real smile he'd seen from her, and Evander felt something shift inside him, like a compass finding true north. He didn't know who he had been before the accident, but he was beginning to suspect that none of that mattered as much as who he might become because of the woman standing beside his bed. The most dangerous patients aren't the ones who fight you. They're the ones who make you forget why you built walls in the first place. Delaney Muir had exactly 3 rules that had kept her sane during 8 years of nursing. Never get personally involved with patients, never work overtime unless absolutely necessary, and never, under any circumstances, let someone's pain become your own. Tonight, as she stood outside room 314 with Evander Sloan's chart in her hands, she was beginning to realize that all 3 rules were in serious jeopardy. It had been 72 hours since he'd awakened, and each shift brought small changes. His physical injuries were healing remarkably well. The bruised ribs, the laceration on his forehead, the countless scrapes and bruises that painted his arms like a road map of the accident. But it was the way he looked at her that unsettled her most, not with the glazed gratitude of most patients, or the demanding entitlement she'd learned to expect from wealthy clientele, but with an intensity that made her feel seen in a way that was both thrilling and terrifying. "You're stalling," she murmured to herself, finally pushing open the door. Evander was sitting up in bed, staring out the window at the Seattle skyline. The morning light caught the sharp angles of his face, highlighting the healing cut along his temple. Someone, probably his legal team, had brought him real pajamas to replace the hospital gown, charcoal gray cotton, that somehow made him look less like a patient and more like a man who happened to be temporarily inconvenienced by medical care. "Good morning," she said, keeping her voice professionally pleasant as she approached his bedside. "Delaney." The way he said her name, like he'd been practicing it, sent an unwelcome flutter through her chest. "I was wondering if you were working today." "I'm here." She busied herself checking his foreline, acutely aware of how he watched her every movement. "How did you sleep?" "I dreamed about driving," he said quietly, "but not the accident. Just driving somewhere. I couldn't see where I was going, but I wasn't alone." Something in his tone made her pause. "Do you remember who was with you?" He shook his head, frustration flickering across his features. "It's all fragments, pieces that don't fit together." His eyes found hers. "The doctors keep asking me about my past, my work, my family, but the only thing that feels real is what?" she asked, even though she was afraid of the answer. "This, right now. You." Delaney's hand stilled on his chart. She'd heard variations of this before. Patients who fixated on their caregivers, who mistook medical attention for something more meaningful. But the way Anders said it wasn't desperate or needy. It was simply honest, as if he were commenting on the weather or the color of the walls. "Mr. Sloan," she began, falling back on professional formality like armor. "It's normal for patients with memory loss to feel disoriented. Sometimes the brain latches on to familiar faces or voices as anchors. It doesn't necessarily mean don't." His voice was gentle but firm. "Don't explain it away." She looked at him, then really looked, and saw something that made her throat tight. Vulnerability, yes, but also a quiet strength that suggested this man had never needed to rely on anyone before the accident. The combination was more dangerous than any desperate plea could have been. "I need to take your vitals," she said, reaching for the blood pressure cuff with hands that weren't quite steady. As she wrapped the cuff around his arm, she was hyper-aware of every point of contact, her fingers brushing his wrist, the warmth of his skin, the way his pulse jumped slightly under her touch. He was watching her face with that same unsettling intensity, as if he were trying to memorize every detail. "Tell me about yourself," he said as the cuff inflated. "That's not really appropriate, Mr. Sloan Evander," he corrected. "And why isn't it appropriate?" "I'm not asking for your social security number. I just want to know who you are." "I'm your nurse." "That's what you do." "I'm asking who you are." The simple distinction caught her off guard. When was the last time someone had asked her that question? When was the last time she'd had an answer that went beyond her job title or her function in other people's lives? She started, then stopped. The blood pressure reading appeared on the monitor, elevated, but not dangerously so. She unwrapped the cuff, using the task as an excuse to avoid his gaze. "I'm nobody special. Just someone who works night shifts and drinks too much coffee." "I don't believe that." "Believe what you want." She made notes on his chart, the pen clicking against the metal clipboard. "Your pressure is a little high. but that's normal for someone in recovery. Delaney, he said her name like a question, patient and persistent. What do you do when you're not here? Despite herself, she found herself answering, I have a small apartment in Capitol Hill. I read mystery novels and watch cooking shows. I'm too tired to try recipes from. I have a cat named Fitzgerald who judges all my life choices. She paused, surprised by how icily the words had come. It's not very exciting. It sounds perfect. There was something in his voice, not pity or condescension, but genuine appreciation that made her chest ache in an unfamiliar way. She'd spent years building a life that was manageable, predictable, safe. No one had ever called it perfect before. The physical therapist will be by this afternoon, she said, retreating back into professional mode. Dr. Morrison wants to see how your coordination is recovering. Will you be here when I get back? My shift ends at 7 o'clock. That's not what I asked. Delaney felt heat rise in her cheeks. She had picked up extra shifts for the past 2 nights, telling herself it was for the overtime pay, but they both knew the truth. I shouldn't be having this conversation. Why? Because you're my patient. Because it's unprofessional. Because she struggled for words that wouldn't reveal too much. Because I have rules. Evander was quiet for a long moment, studying her face with an expression she couldn't read. Finally, he nodded. I understand rules. I think I lived my entire life by them, even if I can't remember what they were. He paused. But I'm beginning to think that some rules are meant to protect us from the wrong things. As Delaney left his room, her hands were shaking slightly. She'd spent 8 years perfecting the art of professional distance, of caring without getting attached, of being present without being vulnerable. It had taken Evander Sloan exactly 72 hours to make her question everything. The most terrifying part wasn't that he was breaking down her defenses. It was that she was starting to want him to. Sometimes, the most beautiful moments happen when you're not trying to remember who you used to be. The rain against the hospital window matched the rhythm of Anders' restless thoughts as he sat in the vinyl chair by the bed, watching the droplets race down the glass. It was his 5th day here, and while his body grew stronger, his mind remained a frustrating puzzle with missing pieces. Fragments would surface unexpectedly. The smell of expensive cologne triggering flashes of boardrooms, the sound of dress shoes clicking on marble floors, voices discussing numbers that meant something important, but none of it felt like home the way Delon's presence did. The door opened with its familiar soft click, and he turned, expecting to see her auburn hair and tired green eyes. Instead, a man in an expensive charcoal suit entered, followed by a woman with a tablet who looked like she lived on protein, bars, and anxiety. Mr. Sloan. The man's voice carried the practiced warmth of someone who made his living managing difficult people. I'm Harrison Vale, your attorney. This is Gemma from your personal staff. We've been handling things while you recover. Evander stared at them, waiting for recognition that never came. I'm sorry, I don't remember you. That's perfectly understandable given your condition. Harrison pulled up a chair, his movements precise and controlled. We're here to help fill in some gaps. You own Meridian Electric, one of the fastest growing companies in sustainable transportation. You have a penthouse downtown, a house in the Hamptons, and about 47 people whose paychecks depend on your decisions. The information felt like studying someone else's biography. Impressive certainly, but as distant as reading about a stranger in a magazine. 47 people, Evander repeated. 49, actually, Gemma corrected, consulting her tablet. We hired 2 new engineers while you've been recovering. The Singapore deal is still pending your approval, and the board meeting scheduled for next week will need to be postponed unless. Gemma Harrison's tone was gentle but firm. Mr. Sloan needs time to process. As they continued talking about mergers and market shares and quarterly projections, Evander found his attention drifting to the hallway beyond the open door. He could hear Delaney's voice at the nurse's station, talking to someone about medication schedules. The sound was more familiar than anything these people were telling him about his supposed life. The important thing, Harrison was saying, is that you focus on recovery. We can handle the business side of things for as long as necessary. What about family? Evander asked. Wife, children, parents. A shadow crossed Harrison's face. Your parents passed several years ago. You were never married. No children that we're aware of. He paused. You've always been very focused on your work, alone. The word hung in the air, unspoken. This successful, wealthy man they were describing had apparently built an empire, but forgotten to build a life. The realization should have been devastating, but instead Evander felt an odd sense of relief. Whatever he had been before, It sounded lonely in a way that made his chest ache. After Harrison and Gemma left with promises to return tomorrow, Evander was alone with the weight of a life he couldn't remember and wasn't sure he wanted to reclaim. The rain had stopped, leaving the windows streaked with water that caught the afternoon light. "You look like someone just told you that you won the lottery and lost your dog on the same day." He turned to find Delaney in the doorway, her scrubs wrinkled from a long shift, but her eyes bright with something that might have been concern. Something like that. He managed a smile that felt more genuine than any expression he'd worn during his visitor's entire stay. "Apparently, I'm very important and very successful. And that's bad because none of it feels like mine." He gestured toward the window where the city stretched out below them. "They tell me I own companies and properties and have people who depend on me. But when I try to feel anything about it, there's just nothing." Delaney entered the room fully, pulling the door closed behind her. The small gesture felt intimate, like she was creating a space that belonged just to them. "Maybe that's not such a terrible thing," she said, settling into the chair Harrison had vacated. "Maybe you get to decide who you want to be instead of being stuck with who you were." The simplicity of the statement cut through all the complexity that had been swirling in his head. "Is that what you think, that I should just forget everything and start over?" "I think," she said carefully, "that sometimes we get so caught up in the life we think we're supposed to have that we forget to ask if it's the life we actually want." There was something in her voice, a note of personal experience that made him study her face more carefully. "Is that what happened to you?" She was quiet for a long moment, her fingers tracing patterns on the arm of the chair. "I was engaged once to someone who had my whole life planned out, where we'd live, what kind of house we'd buy, how many kids we'd have, what I'd do when I stopped working. It all sounded perfect on paper. What happened? I realized that he was in love with the idea of me, not the actual me. And I was so busy trying to be what he wanted that I forgot who I was underneath all those expectations." She looked up, meeting his eyes. "So I left, started over, became a nurse, got my own place, made my own decisions. It wasn't the life I thought I wanted, but it was mine." Evander felt something shift in his chest, a recognition that went deeper than memory. "Do you ever regret it? The leaving?" "Never. The years I spent trying to be someone else." She shrugged. "Sometimes, but I learned something important. The person you've become when you stop trying to meet everyone else's expectations is usually the person you were meant to be all along." As she spoke, a fragment surfaced unbidden in his mind. A woman with perfectly styled blonde hair sitting across from him at a restaurant, talking about children they should have and charity galas they should attend. While he nodded and felt his soul slowly suffocating, the memory was brief but vivid, leaving him with a feeling of claustrophobia he didn't fully understand. "I think," he said slowly, "I might have spent a lot of years being the wrong person," while Delaney said, standing to check his bio bag, even though they both knew it didn't need checking. "Maybe the accident gave you a chance to find the right one." As she moved around his bed, efficient and graceful, Evander realized that for the first time since waking up in this place, he wasn't mourning what he'd lost. He was looking forward to what he might find. The problem was, he was beginning to suspect that what he wanted most was standing right next to him, adjusting his blankets with hands that trembled just slightly when they brushed against his. And she was the one thing his old life had never taught him how to keep. The most honest conversations happen in the quiet moments when people forget they're supposed to be guarding their hearts. Delaney found Evander in the hospital's small garden courtyard at 3 o'clock in the morning, sitting on a bench beneath the single lamppost that cast everything in warm amber light. He was supposed to be sleeping, doctor's orders, but she'd noticed his empty bed during her rounds and somehow knew exactly where to find him. "Couldn't sleep?" she asked, approaching slowly, her sneakers silent on the wet pavement. "Too many dreams." He looked up at her, and in the soft light, she could see the exhaustion etched around his eyes. "They're getting clearer, more detailed, but they feel like watching someone else's life through a window." She settled beside him on the bench, maintaining what she told herself was appropriate distance, even as she noticed how his presence seemed to calm the restless energy that had been buzzing under her skin all evening. The courtyard was small, barely more than a patch of grass with a few benches and a struggling maple tree, but at this hour, it felt like their own private world. "What kind of dreams?" she asked. "Boardrooms, conference calls that lasted until midnight, a penthouse apartment where I ate takeout alone most nights because I was too busy to cook, too tired to care." He was quiet for a moment, staring at his hands. "There was a woman, Alina. She kept calling me about some charity event, talking about our future like it was already decided." The name hit Delaney like a small punch to the stomach. though she couldn't say why. Someone important to you? I don't think so. Not really. She felt like he struggled for the words, like a business arrangement that dressed itself up as a relationship. All the right words, all the right gestures, but no real feeling behind them. Relief flooded through her, followed immediately by guilt for feeling relieved about a patient's personal life. She had no right to care about Onda's romantic history, no business feeling jealous of women who existed only in his recovering memories. The strange thing is, he continued, I remember feeling trapped, like I was living someone else's life, but couldn't figure out how to escape it. Does that make sense? More than you know. The words slipped out before she could stop them. He turned to study her profile in the lamplight. Tell me about him. The fiancé, Colton. The name felt dusty in her mouth, like something she hadn't touched in years. He was everything my mother thought I should want. Successful, charming, had a 5-year plan that included a house in Bellevue and 2.5 children. He proposed at Christmas dinner in front of both our families, but you said no. I said yes. She pulled her cardigan tighter around herself, though the night wasn't particularly cold. Spent 8 months planning a wedding that felt like planning my own funeral. The dress, the flowers, the venue, everything perfect, except the fact that I felt like I was disappearing a little more each day. What changed? Delaney was quiet for a long moment. Remembering one morning I was getting ready for work and he was talking about honeymoon destinations while I braided my hair. He said something about how I wouldn't need to work after we got married, how I could focus on more important things, and I realized he'd never once asked me what I wanted those important things to be. So, you left 3 weeks before the wedding, called off everything, moved out, broke my mother's heart, and embarrassed my father in front of half of Seattle. She managed a small smile. Best decision I ever made, even if it was the hardest. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the occasional night shift worker pass by the windows above them. The city hummed quietly around them. Distant traffic, the whisper of wind through the trees, the faint sound of machinery from somewhere deep in the hospital. Can I ask you something? Evander Sloan's voice was carefully neutral. Sure. Are you afraid of me? The question caught her off guard. Afraid? Why would I be afraid of you? Because you keep your distance professionally. I mean, you're kind, you're caring, but there's always this invisible line you won't cross. Like, you're protecting yourself from something. Delaney felt heat rise in her cheeks. She'd thought she was being subtle, maintaining appropriate boundaries. Apparently, she'd been more transparent than she'd realized. I'm not afraid of you, she said quietly. I'm afraid of myself. What do you mean? She turned to face him fully, something shifting in her chest as their eyes met. I'm afraid of how easy it would be to care about you. I'm afraid of how much I look forward to seeing you every day. I'm afraid that when you get your memory back and remember who you really are, you'll realize that whatever this is between us was just, she gestured helplessly, just circumstance. Evander was quiet for a long moment, his gaze never leaving her face. What if I don't want my old life back? You don't know what you're saying, don't I? He shifted closer on the bench, close enough that she could smell his soap. See the small scar above his eyebrow that the accident had left. What if getting my memory back just confirms what I already suspect, that I was living the wrong life with the wrong people for all the wrong reasons? Evander, you know what the strangest thing is? Every fragment that comes back feels cold, calculated, empty. Business deals and social obligations and relationships that were more like contracts. But this, he gestured between them, this feels real, more real than anything in those recovered memories. Despite every professional instinct screaming at her to maintain distance, Delaney found herself leaning closer. You're confused. The accident, the memory loss, it's affecting your judgment. Is it affecting yours, too? The question hung between them like a challenge, because the truth was, she had never felt less confused about anything in her life. Every logical part of her brain was telling her to walk away, to keep things professional, to protect herself from the inevitable heartbreak when he remembered his real life and went back to it. But her heart was telling her something entirely different. Yes, she whispered. He reached out slowly, giving her every chance to pull away, and touched her hand where it rested on the bench between them. His fingers were warm, slightly rough at the tips, and the contact sent electricity up her arm. Then maybe we're both crazy, he said softly. Maybe we are. As they sat there in the amber lamplight, hands barely touching, Delaney realized that for the first time in her carefully controlled life, she was considering throwing caution to the wind. Not for a fantasy, not for someone who wanted to change her, but for a man who looked at her like she was exactly who she was meant to be. The most dangerous part wasn't that she was falling for a patient. It was that she was beginning to believe he might be falling for her, too. Some lines once crossed can never be uncrossed, and sometimes that's exactly what makes them worth crossing. The morning after their conversation in the garden, Delaney moved through her rounds with the mechanical precision of someone trying not to think too hard about what had happened between them. But every time she passed room 314, her steps slowed and her heart did that annoying flutter that reminded her she was in dangerous territory. She was adjusting the medication cart when Dr. Morrison approached, his expression more serious than usual. "Delaney, I need to speak with you about Mr. Sloan." Her stomach dropped. "Is everything all right?" "His vitals have been stable, and his vitals are fine. It's something else." Dr. Morrison glanced around the busy hallway, then guided her toward his office. "Close the door, please." The small office felt suffocating as Delaney took a seat across from the doctor's desk, her mind racing through every interaction she'd had with Evander, every professional boundary she might have crossed. "I've received some feedback about your care of Mr. Sloan," Dr. Morrison began, his tone carefully neutral. "Apparently, you've been spending considerable time with him outside of standard nursing duties." Heat flooded Delaney's cheeks. "Who said that? That's not important. What's important is that we maintain professional boundaries with all our patients, regardless of their circumstances." He leaned forward, his expression softening slightly. "I know you're a dedicated nurse, Delaney, one of the best we have, but this particular patient's situation is delicate. Mr. Sloan is a very wealthy, very influential man. And when he recovers his memory, you think I'm taking advantage of him." The words came out flat, emotionless. "I think you're a young woman who's been working too many night shifts, and he's a vulnerable patient who's attached himself to the first kind face he saw. These situations can become complicated very quickly." Delaney stared at her hands, feeling something crumble inside her chest. "Are you removing me from his case?" "I'm suggesting you request a transfer to distance yourself from the situation before it becomes problematic." Before she could lose her job, before she could get her heart broken, before Ander remembered who he really was and forgot all about the night nurse who had held his hand in a hospital garden. "I understand," she said quietly. "Good. I'll arrange for Nurse Patterson to take over Mr. Sloan's care starting tomorrow." As Delaney left Dr. Morrison's office, her chest felt tight with unshed tears and unspoken words. She had known this moment would come, had been preparing for it even, but the reality of walking away from Evander felt like tearing away a part of herself she'd only just discovered. She managed to avoid room 314 for most of her shift, but as evening approached and the hospital settled into its quieter nighttime rhythm, she found herself standing outside his door with her hand on the handle. This would be the last time. Tomorrow, someone else would check his vitals. Someone else would listen to his dreams and fears. Someone else would see that smile that had become the best part of her day. Taking a deep breath, she pushed open the door. Evander was reading a book, something his legal team had brought from his apartment, but he looked up immediately when she entered, his face brightening in a way that made her heart ache. "There you are," he said, setting the book aside. "I was starting to think you were avoiding me." "Just busy," she said, forcing her voice to sound normal as she approached his bedside. "How are you feeling?" "Better, much better, actually. Dr. Morrison says I might be discharged tomorrow if my cognitive tests continue to improve tomorrow." The word hit her like a physical blow. That's wonderful news." But even as she said it, Evander's expression shifted, his eyes narrowing as he studied her face. "What's wrong?" "Nothing's wrong. You're recovering beautifully." "And Delaney," he said her name like a question, gentle but insistent. "What happened?" She tried to maintain her professional composure, but something in his voice, the concern, the familiarity, the way he said her name, like it mattered, broke something loose inside her. "I'm being transferred to day shift," she said quietly. "Starting tomorrow, someone else will be taking care of you." Evander went very still. "Because of us." It wasn't a question, and she didn't try to pretend otherwise. "Because I crossed lines I shouldn't have crossed. Because I forgot how to be just your nurse." "Good," he said firmly. "Good." The response caught her off guard. "Good that you forgot how to be just my nurse. Good that you crossed those lines." He swung his legs over the side of the bed, moving closer to where she stood. "Because I sure as hell forgot how to be just your patient. Evander, this is impossible. You're going to get your memory back. You're going to remember your real life. And what if I don't want my real life back? He stood up and suddenly they were face to face, close enough that she could see the flecks of gold in his dark eyes. What if the only real thing I've felt since waking up in this place is what I feel when I'm with you? You don't understand. Then help me understand. He reached up, his fingers barely grazing her cheek. Tell me why you're running away. Because I'm scared, she whispered, the truth spilling out before she could stop it. I'm scared that what I feel for you is real, and I'm scared that what you feel for me is just gratitude mixed with confusion. I'm scared that when you remember who you really are, you'll realize I'm just what? Just a night shift nurse from Capitol Hill who reads mystery novels and has a judgmental cat. Evander Unk's expression softened and he stepped closer, close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from his body. What if that's exactly who I want you to be? Before she could respond, before she could think of all the reasons why this was a terrible idea, he leaned down and kissed her. It was soft at first, tentative like he was asking a question, but when she didn't pull away, when she found herself rising on her toes to meet him, the kiss deepened, became something desperate and honest and completely devastating. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Delaney realized that every wall she'd built around her heart had just crumbled to dust. I have to go, she whispered, even as every cell in her body was screaming at her to stay. I know, he said, his forehead resting against hers, but this isn't over, Delaney. Whatever happens with my memory, whatever I remember about my old life, this isn't over. As she walked out of room 314 for the last time, Delaney's lips still tingled from his kiss, and her heart was breaking and soaring simultaneously because she had just kissed a man she was falling in love with, and tomorrow she would have to pretend it never happened. The cruelest irony of healing is that sometimes getting better means losing the only thing that made you feel whole. 3 weeks after leaving the hospital, Evander sat in the floor-to-ceiling windows of his downtown penthouse, staring out at Elliott Bay. While fragments of his old life reassembled themselves like pieces of a jigsaw puzzle he wasn't sure he wanted to complete. The apartment was exactly as his team had described: minimalist, expensive, cold, everything in its perfect place, including the life he was supposed to step back into. His phone buzzed constantly with calls from business associates, investors, and people whose names he was beginning to remember, but whose faces still felt like strangers. Helena had called 17 times in the past week, each voicemail more insistent than the last, talking about postponed dinner plans and charity events as if the past month had been nothing more than an inconvenient delay. But the only call he wanted to receive never came. The neurologist had been pleased with his progress. Remarkable recovery, Dr. Chen had said during his latest appointment. Your cognitive function is at 95% and most of your long-term memories have returned. You should be able to resume normal activities within the week. Normal activities, as if anything about his life felt normal anymore. Evander reached for the leather portfolio Harrison had left on his coffee table. Quarterly reports, acquisition proposals, merger documents that apparently couldn't wait another day. He opened it dutifully, trying to summon interest in profit margins and market shares, but the numbers blurred together. His mind kept drifting to auburn hair and tired green eyes, to the way Delaney's voice sounded when she laughed, to the softness of her lips against his. He'd tried to find her, had even driven past Presbyterian Hospital twice, but what could he say? Hello, I'm the patient you kissed, who you're probably trying to forget. The intercom buzzed, jolting him from his thoughts. Mr. Sloan, Ms. Helena Whitmore is here to see you. Evander closed his eyes briefly. He'd been avoiding this conversation, but Helena was nothing if not persistent. Send her up. 5 minutes later, his front door opened with the click of expensive heels on marble. Helena swept into his living room like she owned it, her platinum blonde hair perfectly styled, her designer dress probably costing more than most people made in a month. She was beautiful in the calculated way of someone who had perfected her appearance as a business strategy. Darling, she said, crossing to him with arms outstretched, you look wonderful. Much better than I expected after such a terrible ordeal. She leaned in to kiss his cheek, and the scent of her perfume, something floral and overwhelming, triggered a cascade of memories. Charity galas, where they'd posed for photographs, business dinners, where she'd discussed their future with the boardwives, conversations about children and country clubs, and a life that had felt like wearing someone else's clothes. Helena, he stepped back, putting distance between them. I wasn't expecting you. Of course, you weren't. You've been avoiding my calls, like I have some contagious disease. She settled onto his white leather sofa, crossing her legs with practiced elegance. But I understand. You've been through a trauma. Dr. Morrison assured me that some personality changes are normal after head injuries. Dr. Morrison, the name hit him like a punch to the gut. The doctor who had been treating him at the hospital. The one who had probably ordered Delaney's transfer. You spoke to Dr. Morrison. Well, naturally, I was concerned about you. And since we're practically family, she waved her hand dismissively. He was very professional, of course, but he did mention that you'd become somewhat attached to one of the nursing staff. Apparently, it's quite common with amnesia patients. Something cold and sharp settled in Anders' chest. What exactly did he tell you? Nothing inappropriate, darling, just that you'd formed what he called a therapeutic dependency on your night nurse. He was quite concerned that it might complicate your recovery, so he had her transferred to prevent any unpleasantness. The casual way she said it, like Delaney was a problem to be solved, rather than a person who had mattered, made anger rise in his throat like bile. Her name is Delaney, he said quietly. I'm sure it is. Helena's smile was sharp around the edges. But that's all behind you now. You're better, you're home, and we can finally move forward with our plans. The Steinberg Foundation Gala is next month, and I've already told everyone you'll be there. It will be the perfect opportunity to show everyone that you're completely recovered. Our plans, the phrase triggered another memory. Sitting in the same living room 6 months ago, while Helena talked about engagement announcements and wedding venues, while he nodded and felt something inside him slowly dying. What plans? He asked. Helena's perfectly sculpted eyebrows rose. Our wedding plans, darling. I know the accident delayed everything, but we're not engaged. Well, not officially, but we've discussed it extensively. You said you wanted to wait until the Meridian merger was complete, and now that you're recovered, Helena, his voice was sharper than he intended. We're not getting married. We were never getting married. For the first time since entering his apartment, Helena looked genuinely surprised. Evander, I think the head injury is affecting your judgment more than you realize. Perhaps you should speak to Dr. Morrison again. My judgment is fine. He moved to the window, needing distance from her and the suffocating cloud of expectations she carried. What's changed is that I remember what it felt like to want something real. Real. Helena's voice rose slightly. What we have is real. We make sense together. We move in the same circles. We want the same things. No, he said, turning to face her. You want those things. I just went along with them because it was easier than figuring out what I actually wanted. Helena stood her composure, cracking slightly. This is about her, isn't it? The nurse event. She was doing her job. Whatever you think you felt, don't. The word came out like a warning. Don't tell me what I felt. She's nobody. Helena's mask finally slipped completely, revealing the calculation beneath the charm. She's a night shift nurse who probably makes $30,000 a year. She has nothing to offer you. Nothing that matters in your world. She offered me herself, Evander said quietly. The real herself. Not some perfectly curated version designed to fit into my life, but who she actually is. Messy and honest and beautiful in ways that have nothing to do with appearances or social status. Helena stared at him for a long moment, her face cycling through emotions before settling on cold fury. Fine. You want to throw away everything we've built for some ridiculous fantasy? Go ahead. But don't come crying to me when you realize that love doesn't pay for penthouses or private jets or the life you're accustomed to. After she left, slamming the door behind her, Evander stood alone in his perfect apartment, surrounded by the trappings of a life that felt more foreign now than when he'd had amnesia. He walked to his desk and pulled out his phone, scrolling to the contact he'd been staring at for weeks without calling. Delaney's number, which he'd gotten from the hospital directory through means he preferred not to examine too closely. His finger hovered over her name for a long moment before he finally pressed call. It went straight to voicemail. Delaney, it's Evander. I know you probably don't want to hear from me, and I understand why. But I need you to know that getting my memory back didn't change anything. If anything, it made me more certain that what I felt with you was the most real thing in my life. He paused, staring out at the city lights that suddenly felt as cold and distant as everything else in his world. I know who I was before the accident, and I know who I became when I was with you. I choose who I became. I choose you, if you'll have me. After he hung up, Evander realized that, for the first time since regaining his memory, he felt like himself again. Not the perfectly controlled businessman, but the man who had fallen in love with a night shift nurse's laugh. Sometimes the words you've been waiting to hear arrive at exactly the moment you've convinced yourself you'll never hear them. Delaney stared at her phone screen in the break room of Seattle General, where she'd been working day shifts for 3 weeks that felt like 3 years. The notification showed one missed call and one voicemail from a number she'd memorized but never expected to see again. Her hands trembled as she held the device, Fitzgerald purring in the background of her mind like white noise. She'd been doing well, she told herself. The day shift was busier, more chaotic, which left less time to think about amber-lit gardens and the way someone had looked at her like she was the answer to questions he didn't even know he was asking. She'd thrown herself into work, picked up extra shifts, even started reading a new mystery series that she couldn't concentrate on because the male protagonist reminded her too much of. No, she couldn't keep doing this to herself. The break room was empty except for the humming of the ancient coffee machine and the distant sounds of hospital life beyond the thin walls. Delaney glanced around to make sure she was alone, then pressed play on the voicemail. Evander's voice filled the small space and her heart immediately forgot how to beat properly. Delaney, it's Evander. I know you probably don't want to hear from me, and I understand why, but I need you to know that getting my memory back didn't change anything. If anything, it made me more certain that what I felt with you was the most real thing in my life. She closed her eyes, pressing the phone against her ear, as if she could somehow pull him closer through the device. His voice sounded different, stronger, more sure of himself, but with an underlying vulnerability that made her chest ache. I know who I was before the accident, and I know who I became when I was with you. I choose who I became. I choose you, if you'll have me. The voicemail ended, leaving her sitting in the fluorescent-lit break room with tears streaming down her cheeks and her carefully constructed walls crumbling around her. He chose her, even with his memory back, even knowing who he really was and what his life had been. He was choosing her, but the rational part of her brain, the part that had survived Colton's expectations and her mother's disappointment and 8 years of careful emotional distance, whispered warnings. He was a billionaire. She was a nurse. His world was penthouse apartments and business mergers. Hers was studio apartments and grocery store coffee. How could that possibly work? Her phone buzzed with a text from her coworker, Jessica. Emergency in room 402. Need you now. Delaney wiped her eyes, shoved her phone in her scrubs pocket, and hurried back to work. But throughout the rest of her shift, through medication rounds and patient consultations and the endless paperwork that consumed her days, Evander's voice echoed in her mind. I choose you. By the time her shift ended at 7, Delaney had made a decision that terrified and exhilarated her in equal measure. Instead of taking the bus home to her apartment, where she would spend the evening analyzing every word of his message, she found herself walking the 12 blocks to the Meridian Tower. The building's lobby was all marble and brass with security guards who looked like they could bench press small cars, the kind of place where she definitely didn't belong, wearing scrubs that had seen better days and sneakers that squeaked against the polished floor. Can I help you? The security guard's tone was politely dismissive. I'm here to see Evander Sloan penthouse level. The words came out more confidently than she felt. Is Mr. Sloan expecting you? No, yes, maybe. I'm returning his call. The guard studied her for a moment, probably cataloging every way she didn't fit in this pristine environment. Finally, he picked up a phone. Mr. Sloan, there's a lady here to see you. Says she's returning your call. A pause, then, yes sir. He hung up and gestured toward the elevator bank. Penthouse level. He'll meet you at the elevator. The ride up felt like the longest 30 seconds of her life. Delaney caught her reflection in the polished elevator doors, hair escaping from her ponytail. No makeup. Still wearing the same scrubs she'd been wearing for the past 12 hours. She looked exactly like what she was, a working nurse at the end of a long day. When the elevator doors opened, I was waiting. He looked different than he had in the hospital, broader somehow, more commanding in his own space. He was wearing jeans and a simple gray sweater, but even casual clothes couldn't hide the fact that he belonged in this world of expensive everything. For a moment, looking at him in his natural habitat, Delaney felt every difference between them like a physical weight, but then their eyes met, and she saw the same man who had sat with her in a hospital garden at 3 o'clock in the morning, telling her about dreams he couldn't remember and feelings he couldn't explain. You came, he said softly. I got your message. And Delaney stepped out of the elevator, into what was probably a foyer that cost more than her annual salary. Floor-to-ceiling windows showed the city spreading out below them like a carpet of lights. Everything was beautiful, expansive, perfect, and somehow cold despite the warm amber lighting. And I think you're crazy, she said. Something flickered across his face. Disappointment maybe, or resignation. I know how this looks. I know what people will say, what they'll think about. I think you're crazy, she interrupted, for thinking I wouldn't want you to choose me. The silence that followed was electric. Evander stared at her, hope and disbelief wearing in his expression. I've spent 3 weeks trying to convince myself that what happened between us was just circumstance. Delaney continued, her voice getting stronger with each word, that you were confused and I was lonely and none of it was real. But the truth is, I've never felt more like myself than I did when I was with you. And if you're willing to risk everything for the chance that this could work. She took a step closer, close enough to see the flexes of gold in his dark eyes. Then so am I. I closed the distance between them in 2 quick strides, his hands coming up to frame her face like she was something precious and fragile. Are you sure? He asked. Because once we do this, once we try this, there's no going back to being strangers. Good, she whispered. I was getting tired of pretending I didn't miss you every single day. When he kissed her this time, it wasn't desperate or uncertain like it had been in the hospital. It was a promise, a commitment. A choice they were both making with open eyes and full hearts. When they finally broke apart, Evander rested his forehead against hers, both of them breathing hard. I love you, he said simply. I don't care if it's too soon to say it or if it complicates everything. I love you, and I needed you to know. Delaney felt tears prick her eyes, but for the first time in weeks, they were happy tears. I love you, too, she whispered back. Even though you're completely crazy, we both are. He said, and she could hear the smile in his voice, as they stood there in his penthouse, holding each other against the backdrop of the glittering city. Delaney realized that sometimes the most terrifying risks were the ones most worth taking. Love is easy when it's just 2 people in a room, but the real test comes when you have to defend it against a world that doesn't understand. 2 months after their reunion, Delaney was beginning to understand that loving Evander Sloan came with complications she hadn't anticipated. It wasn't the money, though she still felt slightly dizzy every time he casually mentioned things like the helicopter or the house in Aspen. It wasn't even the media attention, which had been mercifully minimal since they'd been careful about public appearances. It was the subtle, constant reminder that she was living between 2 worlds that seemed determined not to coexist. She was thinking about this as she stood in the bathroom of Anders' penthouse, staring at the evening gown hanging on the back of the door. The Steinberg Foundation Gala, their first official public appearance together, was tonight, and the black silk creation that probably cost more than her monthly rent felt like a costume for a role she wasn't sure she could play. You're overthinking it. Evander Unk's voice came from the bedroom, warm with affection and something that might have been nerves. I'm thinking exactly the right amount, she called back, adjusting the delicate straps for the 5th time. Do you know how many news articles I found online about us? 47 and 32 of them used the phrase unlikely pairing. Since when do you care what strangers think? The question was fair, but it hit closer to home than he probably realized. She'd spent the past 8 weeks watching people's reactions when they learned she was dating Evander Sloan. The raised eyebrows from her coworkers, the calculating looks from his business associates, the barely concealed amusement from people who seemed to think she was some kind of amusing experiment he was conducting. Since those strangers started affecting my job, she said, seeing out of the bathroom. Evander was adjusting his bow tie in the mirror, but he turned when he saw her, his expression shifting to something that made her stomach flutter despite her anxiety. You look, he seemed to struggle for words. You look incredible. I look like I'm playing dress up. You look like yourself, a beautiful, confident woman who happens to be wearing a stunning dress. He crossed to her, his hands settling gently on her waist. What happened at work? Delaney had been hoping to avoid this conversation until after the gala, but Evander had always been too perceptive for his own good. Dr. Henley made some comments about my new connections when I requested time off for tonight. Nothing overt, just implications that maybe I was getting special treatment because of my relationship. Something dangerous flickered in Anders' eyes. What kind of implications? The kind that suggests maybe I'm not taking the job seriously anymore, that maybe I'm more interested in social climbing than patient care. She turned away from him, pretending to check her reflection in the mirror. He's not wrong. You know, I have been distracted. I've been turning down overtime, leaving on time, instead of staying late to help with admits. I've been living like someone who has a life outside of work. That's called having work-life balance. It's healthy. It's suspicious when you're a nurse who used to live at the hospital. She faced him again, seeing her own fears reflected in his concerned expression. People are starting to talk, Evander, about whether I'm still committed to my career, whether I can be trusted with important cases, whether you deserve to be happy. His voice was quiet but firm, because that's what this is really about, isn't it? You're afraid that choosing me means giving up who you are. The accuracy of his observation made her chest tight. Aren't you afraid of the same thing? Terrified, he admitted. Every day I wake up wondering if I'm asking too much of you, if loving me means you have to become someone you're not. They stood there in the elegant bedroom, both dressed for a world that felt foreign to her and familiar to him, confronting the fears they'd been dancing around for weeks. The board met yesterday, Evander said suddenly. Harrison thought I should know that there's been discussion about my personal life affecting my professional judgment. What kind of discussion? The kind where old men in expensive suits question whether someone who makes impulsive, romantic decisions can be trusted with billion-dollar mergers. His smile was bitter around the edges. Apparently, falling in love with my nurse instead of marrying Helena suggests a concerning lack of strategic thinking. Delaney felt something cold settle in her stomach. They want you to choose. They want me to come back to who I was before the accident. Controlled, predictable, emotionally unavailable. He reached for her hands, his fingers warm against her cold skin. The man who would have made a marriage arrangement with Helena because it looked good on paper. And what do you want? I want to walk into that gala tonight with the woman I love on my arm and not care what anyone thinks about it. His voice was fierce with conviction. I want to introduce you as my girlfriend and watch their faces when they realize you're smarter and more genuine than anyone they've ever brought to these things. I want to dance with you and go home with you and wake up tomorrow knowing that I chose happiness over expectations. The passion in his voice made her heart race, but it also made her more aware of everything they were up against. What if it costs you everything? She asked quietly. What if it saves me from a life that was slowly killing me? He cubed her face in his hands, his thumbs brushing across her cheekbones. Delaney, I spent 35 years building a life that looked perfect from the outside and felt empty on the inside. The accident didn't just give me amnesia. It gave me perspective. It showed me what life could feel like when you're living it instead of just managing it. Before she could respond, his phone rang from the nightstand. He glanced at the caller ID and frowned. It's Harrison. I should take this. Evander answered with his usual professional tone, but Delaney watched his expression change as he listened to whatever his attorney was telling him. His jaw tightened, his free hand clenching into a fist. When? He asked sharply. How much do they know? A pause then. No, absolutely not. We're going to the gala, as planned. He hung up and turned to face her, his expression grim. What is it? She asked, though part of her already knew she didn't want to hear the answer. Someone leaked to the press that we met when I was a patient in the hospital. The story is going live in an hour, just in time for the evening news. His voice was carefully controlled, but she could see the anger simmering beneath the surface. They're calling it a scandal. Inappropriate nurse-patient relationship, possible ethical violations, questions about my mental capacity during recovery. Delaney felt the blood drain from her face. They're going to destroy both our careers. They're going to try. Evander was already moving toward his closet, his movements sharp with determination. Harrison wants us to skip the gala, release a statement tomorrow denying everything. He thinks we can control the narrative if we get ahead of it. Maybe he's right. Maybe we should know. Evander emerged from the closet with a different bow tie. His expression set with the kind of resolve she'd seen glimpses of but never fully witnessed. I'm done hiding. I'm done pretending that loving you is something I should be ashamed of. If they want a scandal, let's give them one they'll never forget. He crossed to her, his hands settling on her shoulders with gentle firmness. Delaney Muir, will you go to this gala with me tonight? Will you let me introduce you to Seattle's elite as the woman who saved my life in more ways than one? Will you dance with me while cameras flash and gossip columnists take notes, and everyone tries to figure out how a nurse from Cap Hill ended up with a billionaire's heart? Looking into his eyes, seeing the love and determination and absolute certainty there, Delaney realized that she had a choice to make. She could let fear win, could step back into the safe, predictable life she'd built for herself, or she could trust that love was worth fighting for, even when the fight felt impossible. Yes, she said, her voice steady despite the chaos in her heart. But I have one condition. Anything. When they ask how we met, we tell them the truth. All of it. Let them make their judgments based on facts instead of speculation. Evander's smile was brilliant and proud and absolutely devastating. I love you, he said simply. I love you, too. Even if we're about to walk into the biggest disaster of our lives. Especially then, he said, offering her his arm with the kind of old-fashioned gallantry that made her heart skip, ready to shock some people. As they headed toward the elevator, Delaney realized that she had never been more terrified or more certain of anything in her life. The greatest victories aren't won in boardrooms or battlefields. They're won in the moment you decide to choose love over fear, no matter who's watching. The Fairmont Olympic Hotel's grand ballroom had never felt more like a gladiator arena than it did when Evander and Delaney stepped through the entrance. The Seattle elite were all there. Tech moguls, political figures, old money families who traced their lineage back to the city's founding, and every single one of them turned to stare as they made their entrance. Delaney felt the weight of 300 pairs of eyes, analyzing everything from her dress to her posture to the way her hand rested on Evander's arm. The whispers started immediately, a serious wave of speculation that followed them across the marble floor. Breathe, Evander murmured near her ear, his voice steady despite the tension she could feel radiating from his body. Remember, half these people are here because they need my money for their pet projects. The other half are just bored and looking for entertainment. And which half is more dangerous? She whispered back, the bored ones. Definitely. Despite everything, his dry humor made her lips twitch into an almost smile. They approached the reception area where name tags and table assignments were being distributed by volunteers who looked like they'd stepped out of a country club catalog. Mr. Sloan, the volunteer's smile was bright and professional, though her eyes kept darting to Delaney with poorly concealed curiosity. Welcome, and you must be Miss Muir, Delaney said clearly. Delaney moved. Of course, I don't see you on our guest list, but she's my guest, Evander said smoothly, his arm tightening slightly around Delaney's waist in a gesture that was both protective and possessive. I believe Harrison Vale called to update the reservation. As they moved into the main ballroom, Delaney became aware of the subtle choreography of social exclusion, conversations that stopped abruptly when they approached, glances that lingered a beat too long, smiles that didn't quite reach anyone's eyes. She'd known this world would be different from hers, but experiencing it firsthand was like learning a new language where every gesture had hidden meaning. If a woman with silver hair and diamonds that probably cost more than Delaney's car approached with the kind of smile that suggested she'd been waiting for this exact moment, how wonderful to see you looking so well. We were also worried after your accident, Margaret. Evander Unk's response was polite, but cool. Thank you. I'd like you to meet Delaney Mira. Margaret's gaze swept over Delaney with the efficiency of someone accustomed to cataloging social hierarchies at a glance. How lovely. And how do you two know each other? The question hung in the air like a challenge. This was it. The moment they'd agreed to tell the truth. Consequences be damned. Delaney was my nurse during my recovery, Evander said clearly, his voice carrying enough that nearby conversations quieted. She took care of me when I didn't even remember my own name. Margaret's eyebrows rose, almost imperceptibly. How fortunate. And now I'm in love with her, Evander said simply. The words landed like a stone thrown into still water, sending ripples of reaction through the growing circle of listeners. Delaney felt heat rise in her cheeks, not from embarrassment, but from the fierce pride she felt watching Evander face down Seattle's social establishment without flinching. I see, Margaret said, her tone carefully neutral. Well, that's quite a recovery story. It is, agreed a male voice from behind them. They turned to see Harrison Vale approaching, his expression unreadable. Evander, might I have a word? Whatever you need to say, you can say in front of Delaney. Harrison glanced around at their growing audience, then seemed to make a decision. The board received a call from the Times. They're running the story tonight with photos from the hospital security cameras. They have you listed as a patient in the psychiatric ward. Delaney felt the blood drain from her face. The psychiatric ward designation would make everything worse. Questions about Onda's mental capacity. Suggestions that she'd taken advantage of a vulnerable patient. Implications that their entire relationship was built on professional misconduct. I was never in the psychiatric ward, I said firmly. Room 314 is technically part of the neuropsychiatric wing, Harrison replied quietly. Same floor, different designation on paper. The distinction won't matter to the press. Around them, Delaney could feel the crowd pressing closer, smartphones appearing as people began to realize they were witnessing the kind of scandal that would dominate social media for weeks. Evander, she said quietly, maybe we should. No. His voice was sharp enough to cut glass. I'm not running from this. I'm not ashamed of how we met, and I'm not going to let anyone suggest that you did anything wrong." He turned to face the growing crowd, his posture shifting into something Delaney recognized as the commanding presence that had built a billion-dollar empire. "Since everyone seems to be so interested in our story," Evander said, his voice carrying clearly through the ballroom, "let me tell you the truth." The room went silent except for the soft chiming of crystal glasses and the distant sound of traffic from the street below. 2 months ago, I was in a car accident that left me with amnesia. I woke up in a hospital room with no memory of who I was, what I did, or what my life had been. I was lost, confused, and completely alone. His eyes found Delaney's as he spoke. The first face I saw was Delaney's. She was professional, kind, and patient with a man who couldn't even remember his own name. Delaney watched the faces around them, seeing calculation, curiosity, and something that might have been sympathy. Over the course of my recovery, I fell in love with her, not because she was my nurse, but because she was the first person I'd ever met who saw me as a human being instead of a business opportunity. She never asked for anything except that I get better. She never tried to take advantage of my condition. In fact, she fought against her own feelings because she knew it was inappropriate. His voice grew stronger, more certain. When my memory returned, I remembered the life I'd been living before the accident, a life of scheduled meetings and strategic relationships and emotional isolation. I remembered who I was supposed to be, and I realized I didn't want to be that person anymore. He reached for Delaney's hand, intertwining their fingers in front of 300 witnesses. "The woman standing next to me saved my life in every way that matters. She's brilliant, compassionate, and strong enough to love someone despite knowing it would complicate her world. If you think that makes her opportunistic, you don't know her. If you think that makes me weak, you don't know me." The silence that followed was deafening. Then, from somewhere in the back of the crowd, someone started clapping. Slowly, others joined in, until the entire ballroom was filled with applause. But Delaney barely heard it. She was staring at Evander, at this man, who had just defended their love in front of everyone, who mattered in his professional world, and feeling something shift in her chest like tumblers clicking into place. "You're incredible," she whispered. "I'm in love," he replied. "Sometimes they're the same thing." As the crowd began to disperse, returning to their cocktails and conversations with this new piece of gossip to dissect, Margaret approached them again. "That was quite a speech," she said to Eve. "It was quite a love story," he replied. Margaret turned to Delaney, her expression softer than it had been before. "My dear, you do realize you've just become the most talked about woman in Seattle. I'm beginning to understand that. Good, because if you're going to be with him, you'll need thick skin and a strong sense of self. This world can be brutal to outsiders." She leaned closer, lowering her voice. "But between you and me, it's been boring as hell for years. A little shake-up might be exactly what we need." As Margaret walked away, Delaney turned to Onda. "So what happens now?" "Now we dance," he said, offering her his hand, "and then we go home and figure out how to build a life that belongs to both of us." As they moved onto the dance floor, Delaney realized that the hardest part wasn't over. They still had to navigate the reality of merging two very different worlds, but for the first time since this all began, she believed they could do it. Because love that could survive public scrutiny, professional pressure, and social judgment was the kind of love that could survive anything. 2 years later, the most beautiful love stories aren't the ones that end with happily ever after. They're the ones that show you what happily ever after actually looks like when you build it together, one ordinary day at a time. Delaney woke to the sound of rain against the windows and the smell of coffee drifting from the kitchen. For a moment, she lay still in the king-sized bed of their Capitol Hill house, listening to Evander moving around downstairs with the quiet efficiency of someone who'd learned to make breakfast without waking his sleeping girlfriend-fiancé. She corrected herself, automatically touching the simple platinum band on her left hand. Even after 3 months, she sometimes forgot about the proposal that had happened, not in some grand romantic gesture, but on a Tuesday evening when they were both exhausted from work and arguing about whose turn it was to buy groceries. "Marry me," he'd said suddenly, interrupting her mid-sentence complaint about his inability to remember they were out of milk. "What, marry me? Not because it makes sense or because it's what people expect, but because I want to spend the rest of my life arguing about groceries with you." It had been perfect. Completely them. She patted downstairs in one of his old Columbia University t-shirts, finding him at the kitchen island with his laptop, a cup of coffee, and what looked like architectural plans spread across the marble surface. Fitzgerald wound around her legs in greeting before returning to his post by Evander's feet. having long since decided that the man who bought premium cat food was worth tolerating. "Morning," Evander said without looking up, but his smile was evident in his voice. "Coffee's fresh. You're up early for a Saturday." She poured herself a mug and settled beside him, peering at the plans. "What's all this?" "The new clinic design. I wanted to run the patient flow by you before we submit the final plans." The clinic, their project, a partnership between Meridian Electric and Seattle General to create a state-of-the-art facility that would provide free healthcare to underserved communities. It had been Delaney's idea, born from late-night conversations about using his resources and her medical knowledge to actually make a difference. "This is new," she said, pointing to a section that hadn't been in the previous design: family consultation rooms. "You mentioned that parents need somewhere private to talk to doctors about their kids' conditions." He turned to look at her, his hair still messy from sleep. "Sound right?" The casual way he incorporated her suggestions into million-dollar projects still amazed her. In the 2 years since the gala, they'd learned to navigate the intersection of his world and hers, creating something entirely new in the process. "Perfect," she said, kissing his cheek. "What time is the site visit?" 10. But I was thinking. He closed the laptop and turned to face her fully. "What if we skipped it? Spent the day being completely irresponsible instead?" "Evander Sloan wants to be irresponsible. Who are you, and what have you done with my workaholic fiancé?" "Your workaholic fiancé learned a few things from a very smart nurse about work-life balance." His eyes were warm with affection and something else. "Mischief, maybe. Besides, it's been exactly 2 years since I woke up in a hospital room and saw the most beautiful woman in the world for the first time." Delaney felt her heart do that familiar flutter. "You remember the date?" "I remember everything about that day. How scared I was, how lost I felt, how you made me feel safe without even trying." He reached for her hands, his thumbs tracing circles on her palms. "I remember thinking that if I could just keep looking at your face, everything would be okay." Was it okay? I mean, better than okay. It was the beginning of everything that mattered. They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, the morning light filtering through the windows of the house they'd bought together. Not the penthouse, which had felt too much like his old life, but a 1920s craftsman with hardwood floors and a garden where Delaney had learned to grow vegetables, and Evander had learned to appreciate the satisfaction of physical labor. "I have something for you," he said suddenly, reaching into his laptop bag. "It's not the anniversary of anything. We don't do gifts for random Saturdays. We do now." He pulled out a small wrapped package. Open its side was a hospital ID badge. Not just any bath. Her old badge from Presbyterian Hospital, the one she'd worn during those night shifts when she'd first met him. "How did you—" "I may have made some calls, asked some favors." He was watching her face carefully. "Look at the back." She flipped it over to find an engraving. The first face that made everything make sense. Tears pricked her eyes. "You ridiculous, sentimental man. Completely ridiculous." He agreed. "Ridiculously in love with you." As she traced the engraving with her finger, Delaney thought about the journey that had brought them here. The media attention had died down after a few months, though they still occasionally appeared in society pages when they attended charity events. Her colleagues at Seattle General had initially been skeptical, but her dedication to the free clinic project had eventually won them over. Evander's board had grumbled about his distraction, until the quarterly profits showed that a CEO who actually went home at reasonable hours was more productive, not less. Helena had married a real estate mogul 6 months after the gala, and now sent them Christmas cards with overly cheerful family photos. Margaret had become an unlikely ally, introducing Delaney to other women who'd married into Seattle's elite and helping her navigate the social expectations that came with being Evander Sloan's partner. But the real victories were smaller, more personal. The way they'd learned to fight without trying to change each other. The way Evander had taught her that she deserved beautiful things without giving up who she was. The way she'd taught him that success meant nothing if you had no one to share it with. "I love you," she said, the words as natural as breathing after 2 years of practice. "I love you too. Even when you steal all the hot water. Even when you leave coffee cups all over the house. Even when you insist on watching those terrible cooking shows. Even when you try to optimize our grocery shopping with spreadsheets." They were both laughing now, caught up in the familiar rhythm of their private joke. All the small irritations that somehow made them love each other more, not less. Evander's phone buzzed with a text. He glanced at it and grinned. "Harrison says the Times wants to do a follow-up piece. Seattle's most unlikely power couple years later. Please tell me you're not considering it." "I'm considering it." Evander, think about it. We could tell people about the clinic, maybe inspire other couples to use their resources for good. Plus, his grin turned wicked. We could finally set the record straight about which one of us fell in love first. We fell in love at the same time. I fell in love the moment I saw you. You took at least 3 days. I was being professional. You were being stubborn. As they dissolved into laughter, Fitzgerald jumped onto the counter and knocked over a pencil holder, scattering pens across the architectural plans with the disdain of a cat who felt he wasn't getting enough attention. Your cat has terrible timing, Anders said, gathering up the scattered pens. Our cat, Delaney corrected automatically. Our cat, our house, our ridiculous life that somehow works perfectly. She looked around their kitchen, at the coffee maker that was too expensive but made perfect law, at the plants she'd insisted on despite his protests that he'd kill them, at the magnetic poetry on the refrigerator that he used to leave her love notes, at the architectural plans for a clinic that would help thousands of people because they'd found each other. It does work, doesn't it? Better than anything I ever planned. He stood and pulled her into his arms, spinning her around the kitchen while she laughed and protested that he was going to make her spill her coffee. When he sat her down, her back against the counter, and his hands on either side of her, Delaney realized that this was what happiness looked like. Not the dramatic movie moment kind, but the everyday sustainable kind. The kind built on inside jokes and shared dreams, and the decision to choose each other every single day. So, she said, reaching up to smooth down his perpetually messy hair, what do you want to do with our completely irresponsible Saturday? Everything, he said simply. I want to do everything with you. Outside, the rain continued to fall on their little corner of Seattle, where a former billionaire recluse and a night shift nurse had built something neither of them had known they were looking for. A love story that was beautifully, perfectly ordinary, and in the end, ordinary was exactly what made it extraordinary. What does love look like to you? Is it the grand gestures and dramatic moments, or is it found in the quiet mornings and everyday choices? Have you ever taken a risk that everyone said was crazy, only to discover it was the best decision you ever made? Your participation in the channel is very important. Please leave your opinion in the comments. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed the story, please subscribe to our channel and leave a comment below letting us know what you thought. Your feedback and support mean a lot to us. Stay tuned for more exciting stories.